Hello, everyone. After a short break, I'm really pleased to say we're back with our weekly review, Palestine this week. As always, I'm joined by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani, to unpack the biggest stories of the week. Mouin, how are you? And thank you for joining us again.
Thank you very much, Nasim, and it's great to be with you again.
Likewise, and I think it's just over a month, and
That's right.
and since then, a lot has happened.
Quite a lot, yes.
Quite a lot. Situation on the ground has gone from, I would say, catastrophic to unimaginable.
Yeah.
Israeli strikes have continued, and death toll is now 52,000. And we will be discussing, of course, as always, the current situation in Gaza, and then move on to the latest ICJ case against Israel. And then we'll discuss the drone strikes, Israel's war of words with Qatar, ongoing strikes on Syria as well as in Yemen. And then we'll move to the US, where we'll discuss the firing of National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, as well as the Anti-Boycott Act, which has been pulled recently, but I think we should still have a conversation about that. But let's begin, as I said, with Israel's new expanded offensive, which was announced yesterday. What is this new offensive that Netanyahu is pushing for?
October of 2023, now more than 18 months ago, but seems determined to achieve. So now they have laid out a new plan, and it consists of several elements of basically concentrating the entire remaining population of the Gaza Strip into ever smaller isolated pockets in the south of the Gaza Strip, destroying every single structure in the rest of the Gaza Strip, reducing it to rubble so that these people will have nothing to go back to, starving the population beyond endurance, and then putting in place a plan by which the only way that these people can get food, water, the basic necessities of life is to go to a distribution center which will be run on Israel's behalf by US mercenaries, distributed once a week. Palestinians will have to go there in order to get these supplies, and it's quite clear. One only has to listen to what the Israelis are saying and look at what they're doing. It's a strategy of annihilation. We have to bear in mind that Israel has prevented the entry of any of the basic supplies necessary to sustain life, food, water, fuel, electricity, and so on, since the 2nd of March. That's over 2 months ago. It has now said that it is determined to implement this plan, whether or not Hamas releases the hostages. And it is saying that the overall objective of this plan is to implement Trump's Riviera Initiative. In other words, a mass expulsion of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. It's clear as daylight. I mean, today you had Israel's finance minister saying, that the objective is total destruction of the Gaza Strip and the expulsion of its population. So there can be no reasonable discussion or debate or disagreement about what Israel is actually seeking to achieve. Israel is pronouncing it loudly. Israel is pronouncing it clearly. Yet its apologists abroad, what I call the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra, and its apologists in the Western media, keep pretending that this is somehow a conflict between Israel and Hamas, that somehow Israel is the most moral army in the world, seeking to limit the damage to the Palestinian civilian population in the Gaza Strip and all the rest of it. I mean, to give one example, since the beginning of March, Israel, as I mentioned, has prevented the entry of any supplies to the Gaza Strip. It has shut off the water supply. No food is allowed to enter. No fuel is allowed to enter. It has shut off the electricity supply. Um, so, on the one hand, Israel is loudly and proudly imposing this medieval barbaric siege on the Gaza Strip. Yet at the same time, anyone who says that this is resulting in starvation and famine, I think over 50 children have already starved to death as a result of Israel's measures. Anyone who points out that imposing a siege has real world consequences is denounced, for making up anti-Israeli myths and fables and so on. And you actually have Israeli apologists saying that the real issue in the Gaza Strip is an obesity epidemic, not starvation. It's beyond words. One listens to what journalists and aid workers in the Gaza Strip are saying, and they're saying basically um, uh, language has run out of terms to describe the absolute horror of what the population of the Gaza Strip is being forced to endure, first and foremost, as a result of Israel's conduct, but not less importantly, as a result of Israel's Western sponsors and allies absolutely refusing to impose any restraint whatsoever on Israel's conduct. Quite the contrary, they continue to actively support it, and at most will issue meaningless expressions of concern. And then, of course, the regional governments, which are too busy currying favor with the Trump administration in Washington, and are basically pretending none of this is even happening.
Mm. There's some of the issues on aid we will discuss in more detail later on. And as you mentioned, the aim here is to restrict Palestinians to three small concentration camps. Let's just call them. Half of Gaza will be off limits, and the three areas will be separated from each other. And of course, the issue of aid itself is a highly contentious issue, which I will get to. But before I do that, want to ask you a question about the situation as it is now. Would the ICJ, for example, not International Court of Justice, would not see this as a further evidence in his genocide case? As we know, one of the criterion in assessing whether someone's committing genocide or not is to see whether the act of whether a country or a state is deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part. So in this case, if you look at everything Israel has done in Gaza, uh, it's made Gaza uninhabitable. So it's clearly, creating conditions of life that will not sustain the population of Gaza. That in itself is clear evidence of that there is genocide. The ICJ, I assume, would look at that in those terms.
Absolutely. And I think by this point, any reasonable observer and anyone with an even basic knowledge of the Genocide Convention and international law will consider it inconceivable that the International Court of Justice will not find Israel guilty of perpetrating genocide against the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip. But, the final determination on this case is several years in the future, at least 2 or 3 years in the future. And more importantly, Israel doesn't give a damn what the International Court of Justice may or may not rule. It doesn't give a damn about about arrest warrants by the International Criminal Court, because the only thing it cares about is maintaining the support and endorsement of its Western allies and sponsors. And as we've seen very clearly, they're not prepared to put any restraint whatsoever on Israel. The only active measure that's been taken during the past 18 months was last week by the European Union, which rushed to Israel's aid when forest fires broke out around Jerusalem. A self inflicted calamity, I should add, because Israel has, over the decades, insisted on planting trees which are more suitable to a European environment in the semi arid environment of the Levant. That's really the only concrete action the European Union has taken since October of 2023. And as long as it's just words and expressions of concern and even the occasional condemnation, but no meaningful actions, Israel is made to understand that it can do as it pleases. It can intensify, it can escalate, it can kill, rape, murder, destroy as much as it wants because it is perfectly fine and acceptable as far as the countries of North America and Europe are concerned. So, is is the International Court of Justice legally and politically significant? Of course it is, but that's in the future, and Israel understands there will be no consequences. I mean, look at the ICC arrest warrant. You just had, I believe it was Greece and France and one other country gleefully opening up their airspace to the international fugitive and indicted war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu to fly through their territory to the United States. Do you really think they would have extended a similar courtesy to an African dictator who was wanted by the ICC? Of course not. But when it comes to Israel, there is always an exception. International law, there's always an Israel exception to the obligation not to starve people to death, to the obligation not to commit genocide and all the rest of it.
You mentioned planting trees, and I didn't want to let that pass without mentioning how a lot of these trees are planted on some 500 Palestinian villages that were razed to the ground, and those trees are really a way of covering up for the crimes and the war crimes, the ethnic cleansing that took place from 1948 onwards. So it's worth mentioning that, and turning our attention back to the issue of aid distribution. So the idea that the more you read about it, the more horrific it sounds. Israel will employ mercenaries, soldiers who fought in Iraq and in Afghanistan from the US to man those aid compounds, whatever that they will be, and and the UN has, of course, objected to this idea. It says it undermines international law, partly because aid has to be passed through vetted and credible agencies, not least the United Nations and so many other aid organizations, not through some mercenary over which Israel has a final say as to who gets to eat, who gets to starve, who gets to die. So the question, I guess, is, since when does the perpetrator of a blockade or a genocide gets to decide, who starves and who survives, and why would the world allow this to happen?
Well, when the perpetrator is Israel, it's by definition acceptable. I mean, that's what we've been, that's a lesson that has been clear over the decades, and particularly so over the past year and a half. But let's be clear, this is not a scheme to deliver aid. Israel claims this is a way to ensure that aid is not stolen from the needy population of the Gaza Strip by Hamas. Uh, there's really no evidence that has been happening and is a significant challenge that needs to be addressed. But even more importantly, Israel's purpose here, acting through these American mercenaries, is not to provide aid, it's to deprive aid. It's to use aid as a political instrument to force the population to move from one location to the other, and ultimately to sufficiently deprive them of aid that they can be forced out of the Gaza Strip. Rather than sustain themselves in the Gaza Strip. And it's for this reason that the United Nations and the leading aid agencies that have been active in the Gaza Strip have categorically rejected this initiative, indicated that they would refuse to cooperate with it in any way, because doing so would make them complicit in Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I should add, this is, as we were discussing earlier, it's part of a broader Israeli strategy, which, were it to succeed, would require tens of thousands of Israeli soldiers to physically occupy the entirety of the Gaza Strip for a prolonged period of time, to be able to root out the Hamas and other Palestinian militants who remain very well and deeply entrenched in this territory. And so, even the idea that it can succeed as a military strategy, I think, is very far from certain. Again, it's one more initiative by the Israeli government to prolong this war indefinitely, in order to continue chasing this chimera of total victory.
Yeah, I guess we should add that Israel has called up thousands of reservists with that aim in mind to
Yes.
take over Gaza completely. And on the issue of aid, this has become big issue in the sense that the ICJ is looking into the case itself. The UN General Assembly has requested an opinion from the ICJ on Israel's obligation to the UN and also with regards to what are its obligations to allowing aid to pass into Gaza. So there's still ongoing discussions about that. Do you want to, I guess, bring us up to speed regarding this ICJ case? This is the third ICJ case against Israel. There is, of course, the genocide case, and the second one, which was to determine if Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza is illegal, and it determined that it is illegal. And now this is the third one, and not to mention, of course, the ICC case. So, I guess, what point does Israel's defiance of international law become its very nature rather than an exception to the rule? It's the rule in itself. Israel's very existence, the way it occupies, the way it governs, the way it exists is defiance of everything we understand from our sense of values and international law and all those principles. So do you want
Well,
to, I guess, bring us up to speed
yeah, I
with
mean,
that?
yeah, just in response to your last point, there's really no serious student of international relations who holds an opinion other than that Israel is a rogue state, pure and simple, given its actions, its conduct, its attitude towards the international community's norms and values, its thorough contempt and disdain for international law and international institutions. And it is this contempt and disdain that led to the case that we're now discussing, which is, of course, that Israel declared UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee Agency for Palestinian refugees, declared it a terrorist organization, passed legislation making it illegal for UNRWA not to operate in territories that Israel, according to the International Court of Justice, illegally occupies. And what happened is, I believe it was Norway, introduced a draft resolution at the United Nations General Assembly to request an advisory opinion from the ICJ about Israel's obligations towards international organizations, including the UN and other third parties, seeking to provide humanitarian aid and assistance to the occupied population, in other words, to the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And last week, I believe it was 2 or 3 days of hearings were conducted at the ICJ in The Hague, in which any interested party, any government that wanted to present its views on the matter was able to do so before the judges of the ICJ. And there was virtual unanimity that Israel was in flagrant violation of its obligations under international law, of its obligations to respect the immunity of the United Nations, and so on. There were, of course, the usual exceptions. The United States took the position that, under its interpretation of international law, anything Israel does is by definition legal. Hungary, of course, and then you had this mealy-mouthed position by the United Kingdom, which was, as Britain so often does, talking out of both sides of its mouth. So those hearings have concluded, and a ruling by the ICJ is expected, I believe, in July. And it's an advisory opinion, which is basically a technical term, meaning that it's an opinion provided to the General Assembly on the basis of a request by the General Assembly. But ICJ precedent has made clear that an advisory opinion by the court is as binding on the international community and its member states as a ruling issued in response to a dispute between two member states.
Let's turn our attention now to the other story from Friday when Israel attacked a flotilla. So this particular ship is known as was named the Conscience. So it was carrying humanitarian aid to Gaza. It was struck by an Israeli drone. The ship was struck twice in international waters near to Malta. Four individuals were injured, minor injuries, I should add, burns and cuts. So, having initially prevented the ship from docking in Malta, allowing numbers of Freedom Flotilla to and allowing the colleagues to provide assistance to their colleagues on the ship, the government of Malta has now given logistical support. So this is based on the press statement from the Gaza Freedom Flotilla organization themselves. But I guess what I was watching this story unfold, and the first thing that came to my mind is that how is what Israel is doing any different to what the Houthis are claiming to be doing, which is attacking ships on international waters? How is that any different? I mean, at least the Houthis can say that their intention is to stop a genocide. What's Israel's excuse other than to make sure nothing gets in the way of completing its genocide?
Yes, and this Gaza Freedom Flotilla, as you know, was seeking to break the siege of the Gaza Strip, to uh, sorry, this flotilla, as you mentioned, is seeking to break the siege of the Gaza Strip by delivering humanitarian supplies to the people in the Gaza Strip. And what Israel did is it waited until the ship was in international waters, not off Cyprus, but off the much more distant island of Malta, which is very far from the Israeli coast. It appears to have sent an Air Force plane, which then released several drones, which bombed the ship in order to disable it so it could not continue with its journey. Now, you mentioned the Houthis. Let's put those aside for the moment. Imagine if the government of Malta or any other government had been the one responsible for this. There would have been a global outcry and a demand for immediate consequences and all the rest of it. But this was Israel, and Israel was doing so in order to fulfill its genocidal agenda in the Gaza Strip. So Malta, the rest of the European states, and the rest of the Western world, basically said either nothing or implied, that Israel has the right to do as it pleases. It's really incredible. I mean, we're now living in a different world um, where international law, um, uh, the kind of conduct that states are expected to conduct and to engage in. All these kinds of norms and values that have been considered normal and required are suspended, are no longer considered applicable when it is Israel that is acting. When Israel is acting, there's an exception. It can do as it pleases, and just as importantly, it can do as it pleases with impunity without any consequences. And this includes attacking a ship in international waters, hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers off its coast. It's really it's beyond words.
Yeah, and another thing that surprised me about this story is that you literally had to go and search this out. It wasn't
Yes,
a story that
omerta.
it wasn't a story that was covered in any mainstream press I can think of. Again, which just underlines the fact that this war or genocide in Gaza will be remembered as also the moment in which the international legal system has also died, because there's so much
Precisely.
impunity. Israel's allowed to get away with whatever it wants, partly because the media has provided cover for its genocide. Let's move on to another story from last week. This one surprised me slightly. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but it did, which is the war of words between Benjamin Netanyahu and Qatar. Netanyahu tweeted and he said that, and I quote, "The time has come for Qatar to stop playing both sides, whatever that means, and with its double talk, and decide if it's on the side of civilization or if it's on the side of Hamas barbarism." I mean, this kind of statement, it's really is quite typical of the way Israelis frame their
Yes.
enemies and any issue, that this is really a war between civilization.
Yes.
Make it, put everything on the line. If we lose, everything dies with us. The whole
Oh,
civilization ends. This is how they
yes.
present any kind of minor issues. So what sparked this war of words with Qatar? I mean, we should bear in mind that Qatar has been mediating. I guess some would say this is a form of overcompensation on the part of Netanyahu, given that he has previously praised Qatar. He's relied on the Gulf state to prop up Hamas, as is widely reported. And there is also the case of the Qatar Gate, where two Israeli officials are said to have received money from Qatar to present, to lobby on behalf of Qatar, or make Qatar
Yes.
present Qatar in a positive light in Israel. So there's all this in the background. So is this really a case of Netanyahu overcompensating and saying, look, Qatar is really the enemy, and everything I've done before should really be wiped out? And how do you see this?
Well, if Netanyahu is the representative of civilization, as the West appears to have decided, humanity really has no future. Look, when you're trying to sabotage negotiations and prevent an agreement from being reached, then of course it's very effective to begin attacking the mediators and to alienate the mediators. So that's the first thing that's going on. The second thing that's going on, as you mentioned, Qatargate, in which the Qatari government hired some public relations firms in the United States in order to bolster its image in Washington. And these firms hired several Israelis who were very close to Netanyahu on the premise, that the road to Washington goes through Tel Aviv. And this became public knowledge in Israel. Netanyahu's response was that he knew nothing about this, that he barely has any connection to these people, but they appear to be quite close with him and appear to have done so with his knowledge, meaning that Netanyahu is once again talking out of both sides of his mouth, playing both sides of the fence. And I think what we're seeing now is partly an effort by Netanyahu to distance himself from the consequences of his own actions and those of his close subordinates. But I think the broader picture we need to understand is that, as has consistently been the case during the past year, the Israeli government does not want an agreement. It does not want an end to its genocidal military campaign. It is determined to continue chasing this illusion of total victory. And I think this campaign against Qatar should also be seen in the context of US President Trump's upcoming visit to the Gulf, and perhaps as kind of a precautionary measure, should this result in pressure from the Gulf states on the U.S. To put the January agreement back on track.
And probably against Israel's wishes. Trump keeps saying Qatar is our friend. He's one of our best allies. So, and while Trump says that many of Israel's biggest advocates and propagandists on social media, you'll see them constantly now vilifying Qatar. There seems to be clearly an order that's come from Netanyahu, which is now infiltrated every single pro-Israeli organization to vilify Qatar as much as possible, and that seems to be the game. But I don't know how far that will take them. You see that also in the US, with many Israelis saying, you want to look at Israeli lobbying, look at the Qatari lobbying in the US. And that seems to be another standard line that's being pushed by so many social media accounts.
Yes,
And
you
it
know,
seems
and
organized clearly,
yeah,
in my view.
yes, and when U.S. Congress begins taking up resolutions to make it a criminal offense to criticize Qatar, we'll talk.
Yeah, we'll get to that later on. Let's now turn our attention to Syria, where there's been ongoing bombing of Damascus and other areas. And what's been striking is how bold Israel has been in bombing Syria. And last week, an Israeli official said that they essentially carried out a warning strike near the presidential palace in Damascus to send a message to Ahmed Shara, the president, that if they wanted to, they could kill him. This is the kind of language that they speak in. And it seems like every time Syria tries to, piece itself together again, Israel escalates its bombing campaign, uh, not giving it or allowing it chance and space to be able to become a cohesive country. Because ultimately, as we've spoken about before, Israel wants Syria to separate into smaller ethnic enclaves, and that is the aim here. I guess just get your thoughts on what's happening in Syria, and also this might be a good time to bring in Yemen as well, where Israel has been, which Israel has struck several times over the past few days, and also the fact that the Houthis managed to penetrate this Iron Dome and strike a neighborhood near Ben Gurion Airport. I mean, this must strike some kind of fear within the Israelis themselves, because Israel has always projected itself as having this qualitative edge over the region, especially in fighting on many fronts, that it can do that. But given how the Houthis have penetrated the Iron Dome, struck a neighborhood near Ben Gurion Airport, it shows that no, there are flaws, there are weaknesses, and now that given it's expanded its war to Syria, to Yemen, to Lebanon, and now thinking of bombing also Iran. I think Israelis must be thinking, do we really have this qualitative edge that we've prized so highly?
Yeah, well, I mean, Israel is behaving not only as a rogue state, but also really as a mafia state. I mean, bombing within spitting distance of the presidential palace of a uh, state and government that hasn't so much as pointed a water pistol at Israel. But Israel does have a clear agenda of seeking to dismember Syria. I believe its defense minister, Israel Katz, said as much, word for word, that Israel's objective is to dismember Syria. And as colonial states often do in such situations, they latch on to a minority which they claim requires their protection. In this case, Syria's Druze community, who have made clear they have absolutely no need for Israel's protection and, in fact, feel threatened by Israel's protection, but has begun conducting these raids and so on the pretext of defending the Druze, who a number of government who've been attacked by a number of government militias. But of course, the irony here is that Israel's bombings have also killed Syrian Druze, and Syria really is at a crossroads now. Is it going to be able to reconstitute itself as a state for all Syrians, or is it going to fall prey to these centrifugal forces in which it becomes a bit like Lebanon during the 1970s, where different communities hold sway over different areas of Syria. That clearly is Israel's agenda, and I think that explains what it's been doing. Of course, it's also occupied since December additional Syrian territory. As far as Yemen is concerned, um, the question is to what extent is this an exchange between Israel and Yemen, and to what extent is it kind of a shadow war between Israel and Iran? Because what happened last week is that the Houthis um, fired a hypersonic ballistic missile, which is believed to have been composed of advanced Iranian components, and this missile managed to evade every single U.S. and Israeli anti missile defense that is situated in Israel. And it is seen as potentially having been an Iranian warning sign to Israel in response to a series of unexplained explosions in Iran. And as you mentioned, to demonstrate to Israel, no amount of American anti-missile technology is going to save you if Iran gets serious about responding to Israel. As far as the Houthis are concerned, Israel responded. First it got all high and mighty about this missile, and then responded by demolishing Sana'a airport in Yemen. But the Houthis have made clear, as they have throughout the last year, that not only will they not be deterred, but that they will intensify their responses to Israel until it ends its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip. So I think we may now see also an intensification of Israeli air raids on Yemen, but the chances that they're going to succeed in putting an end to the Houthis' campaign seems to me very slight.
Let's end our conversation on three stories from the US. And the first is to do with Mike Waltz, the defense secretary, I think his position was.
National Security
National
Advisor.
Security Advisor, sorry, yeah, I forget. It's quite I mean, this is really another example of a seismic shift that's taking place within the mega base, which we will discuss again with regards to the Anti-Boycott Act, which will be our second story. But yeah, I mean, Waltz was basically accused of working for another country, and he was fired because he was accused of scheming with Israel to drag the US into a war with Iran. That's according to the Washington Post. It's another case of private relations between Benjamin Netanyahu, or Israeli leader, with an American taking precedence over national interest. This is not the first time it would have happened. There are other examples we could cite. There are examples in the UK as well. For example, Priti Patel, former UK
Yes.
minister, she was also having private foreign relation meetings with Israel. It is a common thing and used to be a common thing, but now it seems Donald Trump is restrained by his own mega base, who see America's close alliance with Israel as being a hindrance and not being America first, but Israel first. And this is causing a lot of tension. I think this is one of the big shifts that's taking place. Is this how you read this story as well? Or how do you view
Yes.
the firing of Mike
Yeah. I
Waltz?
mean, Waltz had become a key Israeli asset at the highest levels of U.S. government, in significant part because Trump has sidelined many of the key neoconservative and hawks neoconservatives and hawks in this administration. I mean, people who were at the very center of his previous administration, like John Bolton, Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, and the rest of them, who were kind of the Israel First crowd, have been completely shunted aside, and that made Waltz all the more important to Israel, particularly because of his position as national security advisor. And then he was suddenly fired. You know, he had been involved in a number of mishaps previously in terms of leaking, including a journalist and then family members in signal conversations about the U.S. Military campaign against
An
Yemen.
Israeli journalist, American Israeli journalist,
American
Goldberg.
Israeli journalist,
Okay.
indeed. But according to the Washington Post report, which strikes me as entirely credible, his undoing was that he was scheming with Netanyahu behind his own president's back to try to sabotage U.S. Iranian diplomacy and develop operational war plans for a U.S. Israeli attack against Iran. And I think it's indicative of the different nature of both the second Trump administration and of the Middle East this decade, as opposed to the previous ones, that rather than enhancing Waltz's stature, it cost him his job, or at least a demotion. He's now being farmed out and parked at the United Nations, which, you know, the Trump administration considers insignificant, and the damage he'll be able to do there is going to be marginal. I mean, he can praise Israel to the heavens 24/7, and it's not really going to, he can scheme with the Israeli ambassador to the UN all he wants. It's not going to have much of an impact in Washington.
Mm. I mean, it does beg the question, doesn't it? What Biden would have done. I mean, there was a report last week where Israelis, I think someone mentioned that Biden was one of the biggest gifts ever given to Israel for the stance he took. He basically never enforced or demanded a ceasefire, even though publicly he was making those proclamations, but he never really put pressure on the Israelis to accept any kind of ceasefire. And also, if Trump is willing to move because of his base, in this case by firing Waltz, why didn't the Democrats move, given how much support there is within the Democrat base for the Palestinians? If you look at the polls, 76, 80% of Democrats generally sympathize more with the Palestinians than with the Israelis. Despite that, the Democrats never moved an inch. And the more you read about this, the more you find out just how complicit Biden was in this genocide. And here you are, Trump, being a pragmatist. I'm not saying that he's not starting wars, he's pro-Palestinian or anything like that, but at least he knows what's politically he needs to do, which is to please his base. And that's exactly what he's doing. And the Democrats completely dropped the ball on that. Why could they not, try to do something to at least concede and give something to their base, and completely failed to do that?
Well, the American political parties are not beholden to their constituents or to their voters. They're beholden to their funders. It's effectively a plutocracy. And the idea that Biden was going to abandon the billionaires who funded his political campaign and were then funding the Harris campaign, he was going to abandon them and their political priorities in order to satisfy the priorities of his voters. That was never on the cards. It was never going to happen. It cost him the election, but it's a conscious choice he made. I mean, yes, Biden may be senile and all the rest of it, but when it came to Israel, he understood exactly what he was doing. It's the one um, coherent thought that remained with him until the very bitter end.
And I want to ask you again about the boycott act that's been pulled, partly because so many people within MEGA, members of Congress who denounced it, said that we cannot be imposing penalties on, well, punishing Americans for boycotting. That's our right. So I guess, is this the end, end of this particular iteration? Because let's not forget, at least 32 or 36 US states have adopted some sanctions against people boycotting Israel. That's in the American, that's already within US states. So How important is this, the fact that they've pulled this boycott bill from Congress? How do you see that?
I think it's very significant, though I do think it'll be back with a vengeance in altered form before long. I mean, the United States is this strange entity which gives its citizens extraordinary latitude to criticize itself, to criticize its leaders, to even criticize its very existence, but is extraordinarily intolerant of any criticism of a foreign state. In this case, its proxy in the Middle East, Israel. So you can say things about the United States that are considered criminal if you say them about Israel. You're allowed to boycott American products, but you're not allowed to boycott Israeli products. It's very strange. It's um, most governments that behave this way are intolerant of criticisms against themselves. In the United States, again, this very strange situation that it's very tolerant of criticism of itself, but thoroughly intolerant of any criticism of Israel, which last time I
No, I,
checked
I agree with you. I think this
is,
was probably the first iteration, first attempt testing the
yes.
waters, and then they'll refine it somehow and then bring it back again because, as I
Well,
said, boycott has been adopted, or the anti-boycott bills have been adopted by, I think, 30 plus states within the US. So it's not a new thing, and we shouldn't be deceived into thinking that it is a new thing. American, by and large, at least on the state level and governmental level, they're still pro-Palestinian, even though polls after polls show that new generations are turning their backs on Israel, including American Jews. How that will translate into politics, we may have to wait 5 years, 10 years, but definitely it will translate into politics
yes.
at some time.
Well, I mean, this again, strange situation. You could get up in Times Square in New York and call for the destruction of the United States, and it would be considered freedom of expression. But according to this legislation, which has now been defeated, at least in its current form, you risk 20 years in prison for providing information that could help any campaign to boycott Israeli products. It's really beyond words. And of course, the Israel lobby and Israel's apologists have been having a field day with all these kind of legal or legislative measures and criminalization of criticism of Israel and opposition to Israel. But it also, I think, there's a broader lesson here. Um, Israel and its apologists understand that they have irreversibly lost the battle for public opinion, even in the United States, as you pointed out. And they understand that the only option they have left is to suppress discussion and debate about Israel and its policies and its actions. Because to the extent that debate and discussion is allowed, it's going to lead to even greater isolation of Israel in public opinion. And that's kind of the background to these crazy legislative initiatives that threaten critics with fines and jail and all the rest of it.
Mm. Let's end with the big news from, I think I assume will be the biggest news from next week, which is Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia and the region, which starts on May the 13th. And what do you think will happen during that talk? I mean, what we know so far, for his meeting with Saudi Arabia, they've already said that the Americans should not open discussion about normalization or any kind of normalization talks. They've basically taken that off the table. They don't want to have a discussion about Saudi-Israel normalization under the current context. So that's a huge blow, given how this was presented as the biggest prize. And if Trump also fails to deliver normalization, I think he can say bye-bye to his Nobel Peace Prize. That's one of the things he's striving for. So what do you make of the fact that the Saudis have, you know, demanded this prior to the meeting itself? And also, what are you looking forward to next week during Trump's visit? What are you looking to see from his trip there?
Yeah, I mean, there was this very interesting article in Middle East Eye, which reported that the Saudi foreign minister had been to Washington with a very clear message that Saudi's rulers do not want any discussion of the Abraham Accords, so-called, or of Saudi-Israeli normalization, either in public or in private. They do not want to be surprised. And apparently, the Saudi foreign minister, after delivering his message, also reported back his impression that the U.S. State Department essentially plays no role in foreign policy in the Trump administration, and that it's all very much concentrated in the White House. What will be interesting, I think, is the extent to which um, Trump being received like an emperor in Arab capitals, while juxtaposed with images of starving children by Israel's client state, Israel, to what extent that is going to have an impact, and whether there will also be pressure from these governments on the United States to seek to break Israel's siege before he arrives in the region. I don't suspect there will be. I think these Gulf states will very much prioritize, on the one hand, their bilateral relations with the United States on the assumption that under Trump, U.S. foreign policy is basically for sale to the highest bidder. They will prioritize, probably encourage the United States to continue to seek a negotiated agreement with Iran. Syria may be on the agenda as well, but on the available evidence, whatever Israel does in the Gaza Strip and West Bank and Lebanon, these governments really don't consider any of their business.
I'm sure this will be discussed again next week between us, Mouin. Thank you again, and I'm
Yeah.
really pleased to have you back on our show, and I'm really
Likewise.
pleased to restart again after our short break. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, joining me and Nasim Ahmed for our weekly review of Palestine. Thank you for tuning in. Bye-bye.